Dr. Milena Bravermanová is here to speak about the graves of St. Ludmila as a document of her cult. So, historian, archaeologist, member of the Archaeological Institute of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague, and longtime curator of the collection of textiles of Prague Castle, historian of textile production in Bohemia. Welcome, the floor is yours.
So it's a little problematic to speak to have this speech after so deep discussion about the datation of Christian legend, because I use the data which are written in Christian legend. I use them more in the circumstances of the end of 10th century, where is some datation of Christian legend. But for instance, Professor Sommer had yesterday a speech here. He also used this data from Christian legend in the circumstances of 10th century. He declares some examples. So I think the discussion has not been finished, it's continuing, and so if I say something what is not coming in this discussion today, maybe. The fact of the reliquary graves helped to clarify the origin and cause of the cults of the saints. There were specific customs related to graves of saints. The bodies of the saints were initially placed in graves in the ground. From the end of first millennium, the remains were removed and stored in crypts and altars, and finally transferred to decorative chests, in which they were placed on the surface of the altars or by means of columns raised above them. For the saint's presence, his remains were needed, or at least the objects he touched, which, if he were a martyr, were preliminary instruments of torture. Textiles also played an important role. Not only the remains of the saint's original clothing were left in the reliquary boxes, but also all the gradually inserted fabrics. These began the play of role of secondary relics, and as secondary sacraments were then placed in altars or distributed among believers. In Bohemia, among the first saints, we find members of the ruling Premyslid dynasty, namely St. Wenceslas and St. Ludmila, whose torture and translation, probably translation, took place in the period of the beginnings of the formation of Czech state, when Christianity was just taking root. The places where Ludmila graves were located always attracted attention, namely at Tettín and then at Prague Castle in the Bohemia in the Basilica of St. George. The tomb of St. Ludmila, located in the chapel of the same name in the Basilica of St. George, where the princess's remains have been located since the 14th century, was laid open in 1981. In addition to the remains, textiles were also found. The restoration and research brought many findings, which were then used to clarify the customs of what was happening around Ludmila's reliquary tomb. But within a broader historical context, they also contributed to more general conclusion. St. Ludmila was killed at her widow's court in Tettín on September 15, 1921. As the legend of Christian records, after the ceremony, St. Ludmila was buried in the ground. Further narration shows that the grave had the form of a pit sunk there, covered with a wooden board. The prologue states that the oldest place of Ludmila's last rest was outside the fortifications under the castle wall. A survey of written sources and the Tettín fortified settlement itself shows that it was in the area of today's Church of St. Jan Nepomucký, formerly of St. Michael. Christian theorized that miracles took place over the grave. A pleasant scent emanated from the grave and candles were lit on it. So Drahomira had a house built here in the style of a church dedicated to St. Michael, that miracles be attributed to him and not to St. Ludmila. But miracles happen even then. The building was probably a kind of wooden dwelling for the dead, based on a pagan tradition. Christianity then transformed it into a tomb chapel. One of the first attacks of government of St. Wenceslavus in 925 was the transfer of his grandmother's remains from Tetín to Prague. According to Christian, the man entrusted with this task entered the church on October 19, dug up the ground and found that the slab covering the grave had broken. The remains, illegally intact, were picked up, wrapped in rare canvases, and loaded on stretched mounted on horses. The procession arrived in Prague on October 21. When evaluating the records relating to the first funeral of St. Ludmila, it can be said that they correspond to the realities of the first third of 10th century, especially the adjustment of the tomb and the wooden structure above it. The legendary narrative refers to the smell emanating from the place or the statement of the integrity of the body after 4 years of its storage in the ground. In the contrary, the wrapping of Ludmila's remains in canvases can be realistic. In the reliquary box, tailor-made fragments of fine linen non-pattern fabric were found as the oldest textiles, which date back to around the end of the first third of 10th century. It is probably a remnant of a veil or humeral that could have been used in the transfer from Tetín to Prague. You see the pictures, and there are, you will see more pictures of textile, and you will see here also a datation. The datation was made according technological research, artistic research, analogies, and also the datation of the eldest 2-1 textile was done according C14 data. And there are also pictures about some analogy to imagine the textile in the origin place, because all the textile from the reliquary grave of St. Ludmila are on a fragmentary state. And if you remember the first picture where was the open coffin with the Ludmila remnants, you can imagine that this eldest one textile, only flags, only plain tabby, these fragments were found among the Ludmila's remnants. So it means that they were this oldest one. Prince Wenceslavus were waiting for the procession at Prague Castle. The stretcher was brought into then still unconsecrated Basilica of St. George. The coffin was placed in front of the altar, but the grave dug for the remains was flooded with water. St. Wenceslaus sent a message to Regensburg and asked Bishop Tuto to come to Prague, consecrate the basilica, and bury his grandmother's body. The bishop refused, saying that Ludmila should be placed in the earth and wait for proof of her holiness. St. Wenceslaus begged again, and Tuto sent a co-bishop, who then consecrated the church and, after 6 days, placed the remains in the prepared grave. Water no longer appeared in at that time. It is not clear where the grave in the basilica was located. It probably had to be near the main altar because there was a Premyslid family burial ground. You'll see the picture from the archaeological excavation done in 50s in last century, where is painted the situation of the Premyslid grave. Even a water-flooded grave does not have to be just a presentation of a legendist, because due to the jagged slate bedrock of Prague Castle and the existence of more groundwater springs, it can have a real basis. In the case of storage of Ludmila's remains in the Basilica of St. George, also another possible interpretation of the after-mentioned non-pattern textile fragments can be accepted, namely that they were related to the funeral of St. Ludmila at Prague Castle. If it was a humeral, it could have been given by the Regensburg bishop, who was to take part in the ceremony. To answer conclusively the question whether in the case of the transfer of the remains of St. Ludmila to Prague, it was a translation, the aim of which was canonization, is not possible. If we start from the account of Christian legend, then probably yes, because if the remains of St. Ludmila at Prague Castle were buried in the grave in the presence of the Regensburg bishop, so the canonization of the martyr and a member of the ruling dynasty was intended. The time when Christian wrote his legend was relatively distant from 925, but a memory could have been passed on the Premyslid family. Furthermore, it can be assumed that Ludmila's remains found themselves in a cross formation, probably situated at the then main altar near the place where the princess's eldest son, Vratislav, was buried from 921. The form art building was sunk into the subsoil. Its bottom and walls were linened with marlstone and plastered. Another joy to the building are, for example, similar formation in Unterregenbach, Württemberg, Germany, dated back to the 11th century, at the latest and intended as relic tombs. It is therefore probable that the cross formation in the Basilica of St. George was a reliquary grave. However, it is a question of when it was built, because the archaeological research carried out in the 1950s by Ivan Borkovsky did not clearly explain the origin of the formation, as it is nevertheless older than the period around the end of the 10th century. So it could have been the first tomb of St. Ludmila in the Basilica after the transfer of her remains from Tettín. In this case, the formation was built with the intention of storing the remains of the princess here as a woman worthy of special respect, not only as a member of the Premyslid family. However, the cross formation was rather created after the founding the monastery at the Basilica of St. George in 967. Theoretically, it could have been on the site of the original grave of St. Ludmila, which was just modified. A similar situation also later is linked to the remains of St. Hedvika, died 1243 in the Monastery of Trebnice, Poland. During the canonization of the princess in 1267, the original grave was opened and the remains moved to the chapel of St. Peter in the monastery complex. A stone thumb was built here, and a masonry-shaped cross formation was built in the lower part as a box for the remains. Cross formation in the Basilica of St. George could also become part of the main altar. Due to the absence of remains, the altar could have had a table shape. The reliquary tomb under the main altar of the crypt, for example, was located in the church of St. Servac in Quedlinburg. This construction phase dates back to 997 to 1021. The manipulation of Ludmila's remains is also evidenced by the presence of another of the found fabric, namely linen drape with geometric embroidery, dated roughly after 980. However, Ludmila's cult was not widespread at the time, which contrasts with the much faster and more intensively developing cult of St. Wenceslaus. The analogy, which is only on a white black photo, is from Speer, where was found in Staufen burial ground of Indrik the Fourth, very similar veil embroidered, and it's dated around the year 1000. So you see the pattern is very similar, and the datation is also very similar. As a moment when the remains of St. Ludmila removed from the cross formation, the year 999 is offered, when its western arm was partially disturbed by an excavation for tomb number 98, interpreted as the most probable tomb of Prince Boleslav II. At the time, the unit partially lost its function, and the end of 10th century was also a period of change, when the remains of the saints were brought closer to the direct adoration of the faithful. Removing the body box of St. Ludmila from the tomb located under the floor and its supposed subsequent placement directly to the main altar would therefore be in accordance with this. The manipulation is supported by the dating of another reliquary silk fabric dated to the breakout 10th-11th century to the first third of 11th century. The dalmatica was sewn from it. Only its back part has been preserved. It can be assumed that it came to Bohemia as a sewn garment, namely the bishop's underwear. It is possible that it may have been owned by the Prague bishop of German nationality Hedvika, who held office in the years 998 to 1017, and probably attended the funeral of Boleslav II. It is therefore possible that he was the one who devoted the dalmatica to cover in Ludmila's remains after they were lifted from the cross-shaped grave. The presence of ecclesiastical dress in the remains clearly supports at least the local worship of the saints. About this picture, I think that the half part of dalmatica is probably the most precious textile in Bohemia, not only by the textile itself. The fabric was woven in Near East, probably Byzance. It was made by very precious technical weaving protolampas. We have only few examples in treasures and so on. It's very interesting that on the fabric there are two patterns. You see the paintings. In the most part there is the bigger one with medallions filled by birds, and in the lower part there are about 15 centimeters with another pattern, more smaller, and it's very unique example about changing the pattern during weaving. On the black white picture you see the reconstruction how the Dalmatica could appear, because we found some steps from Klavit, very characteristic trimming of Dalmaticas, red clavis, and on the corner you see very close analogy from the grave of Pope Clement in Bamberg. It's dated to the first third of 11th century. In the 11th century, the above ground box with the remains was probably still in the same place. Its opening is evidenced by a mention in the Cosmar Chronicle of 1100, who allegedly saw with his own eyes how St. George Abbessis Wildemut asked the Prague Bishop Hermann to insert into the altar in the newly consecrated church of St. Peter part of the veil of St. Ludmila. The bishop refused, saying that the abbess could keep silent about her holiness and let the old woman rest in peace. However, Wildemut demanded that the relics be subjected to God's judgment. Hermann therefore had a cauldron of a hot coal brought and the clothes thrown into it, but it did not burn, so the bishop had to acknowledge the victory of the abbess. Throwing the fabric into the fire corresponds to the periodic custom of testing the authenticity of relics. Other events related to the remains of St. Ludmila recorded in 1142 the canon of Vyšehrad, when he describes the fire of Prague Castle. The nuns then had to flee the ruin of St. George Monastery and moved to the church of St. Peter under Petřín. After a few days, they began to search for the remains of their patroness, and with the help of the Prague builder Werner, they found Ludmila's coffin intact between the stone and the charred wood. They wanted to take her out of Prague Castle, but they could not open the gate. So they turned to Bishop Otto of Prague and on what to do, but he did not dare to decide and wanted to ask in Rome. The nuns therefore begged to Moravian Bishop Zdik, who, however, demanded the consent of their bishop. Finally, on the advice of the Prague Dean Jindřich and Archdiakon Peter, the nuns opened the coffin, inspected it, and placed it again at the altar. From this narrative, it is clear that the coffin with the remains of St. Ludmila was accessible, could be opened, and was placed next to altar. However, the cult was apparently still limited to the St. George complex, and at the hesitation of the bishop's choice, it did not reach the diocesan level. Nevertheless, he was professed in the Premyslid family, as the name of Ratislav's daughter Ludmila, living in a monastery like a nun, also testifies. The situation changed with the arrival of the provost of St. Vitus chapter Daniel, since 1148, the Bishop of Prague, who began to insert Ludmila's remains into new altars in diocesan churches. About it spoke my colleague, Professor Kubin. To St. Peter Bohnice, in St. Andrew in Prague, Virgin Mary in Řečany, and St. James near Kutná Hora. Due to the removal of the remains after the middle of the 12th century, the coffin must therefore have been opened several times. At the time, a superpelice or rocket made of unpatterned fabric with an embroidered cross in the front could have been attached to the remains. Only the front part of the garment has been preserved. Then back part could be used as a secondary relic, or an incomplete clothing was attached to the remains. After the fire in 1141, the basilica was rebuilt, and the new main altar found itself in an elevated presbytery. Roughly in its original place, the altar of St. Cross was built. It can be deduced from two reports that the remains of St. Ludmila were still in the same place. To the year 1252, in the church of St. George in Prague, blood flowed from the crucified leg. Judge Pomněn whipped this blood with his hand. Lay altars, Judge Pomněn was a layman, were dedicated in the monastery churches to St. Cross and are usually situated in the eastern part of the nave in front of the hall. A similar phenomenon was repeated in 1283, but it was to happen more often. Blood dripped again from the flood of the crucified, who was, as is directly noted, built on the tomb of blessed Ludmila. The described events show that at all times St. Ludmila was already understood as the protector of the whole country, as the recorded moments were related to the period when several unfortunate events took place in Czech Kingdom. Around 1300, Ludmila's remains were already in the beautiful box behind the main altar, mentioned in the sermon of St. Ludmila contained in the Legion Factum Est. After a long time, therefore, the place of direct reverence for Saint changed. At that time, it was the abbess of the Monastery Žovka. She died 1301. From 1302, then Ludmila Premyslovna, Kunhuta Premyslovna, she died 1321. It is probable that during the transmission of Ludmila remains, the skull was separated, for which an artistically valuable bust was made. You saw it in the previous picture. At the time, an unpatterned fabric with an embroidered Christogram could also be used as the last cover of the remains, an altar cover apparently until then lying on the altar of St. Cross. In the connection with the consecration of the new main altar of the Basilica after 1371, the remains of St. Ludmila got into the southern side chapel. Before this move, a figure tomb with an ideal image of the saints was made for them at the beginning of the second half of the 14th century. The transfer of the tomb from the main altar to the side chapel was probably related to the effort to separate the place of worship of St. George on the main altar and that of St. Ludmila. Dating of preserved seals from the box of St. Ludmila testifies to the fact that in the period between the demise of the previous main altar and the probable final closure of the stone tomb at the beginning of the 15th century, it was necessary to keep the body of St. Ludmila elsewhere. This, meanwhile, was apparently forced by the reconstruction of the originally Romanesque chapel. Centrally, at the time, the authenticity of the remains was verified several times. The period of growth of the cult of St. Ludmila and its gradual encoring thus ended, and St. Ludmila has definitely become an integral part of the Czech heaven of the land's patron. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bravermanová. Thank you. I suppose we have still some time for discussion, so we will open the field for the questions. I will just ask the technicians if we can see also the picture from the Zoom, and let me ask if somebody here in the room or online has something to ask. Professor Kubin.
Thank you very much. It was very nice. I am agree with you, only with one point. I would prefer this cross object should be piscina. Should be, for me, is more imaginable that this cross, although it's very small, it's not possible to go down, but it's like primitive piscina here on the Prague Castle. But I'm not expert, so
I think that colleague Jana Maříková, she devoted to this cross-shaped cross, and she excluded that it is piscina. She wrote about more analogies. I don't want to go deeply, but she excluded. And one main point is that the piscina were not situated at that place, but a little more on sides of churches. And about measurements, we don't know if when this cross-shaped building was made, because the archaeological circumstances are not clear. There are two possibilities. One is that close to consecration of St. John Basilica, and the second is around the year when the cloister was built. We don't know it exactly. There are surely two possibilities. If when Ludmila was elected from teaching, it was 4 years after her death, and it was not real body, it were only stone bones, not body. So if it was 4 years after her death, this cross-shaped building was made, the remnants could be done here because the measurements of the wings are more than 1 meter. So I tried it with some painting, and so it could be possible. My opinion is that this cross-shaped building is a little later. I think that Ludmila was, when she was transferred, some grave for her could be made in a very similar place. But it couldn't be normal grave, because surely his bones, when we collect them, the packet could have about 50 centimeters and so, no more. So it could be on a small grave. And then anywhere here, near to Vratislav and so, and when was made this cross-shaped building exactly for Ludmila, only this first grave could be rebuilt for this. But the measurements are more than 1 meter, and the bones could be put in the cross. There could be skull and other bones in the wings.
Okay. Online we have Professor Grzegorz Patz asking for a chance to ask.
Again, sorry. I know that everyone are thinking about lunch. Just coming back to this question about what happened in 1142, because it's coming again. This way of thinking that the answer of the bishop was a sort of excuse. I mean, this mentioning Rome was a sort of excuse, sort of alibi. As I said, I don't believe that, and as I already mentioned, Cosmas is a good example that there were church circles which strongly believed that agreement of Rome was necessary. And another example is, in fact, from the same Mainz province. And 7 years later, in 1149, when the Bernard of Hildesheim was canonized by the Archbishop of Mainz, the Archbishop agreed to add the Bernard to the number of saints, but he explicitly forbid his translation. So the monks asked papal legate for that, and he also refused. And the translation of the papal agreement happened many years later. So that was a comment, but in fact I would like to use the opportunity to ask you the question about the archaeological material. I have no idea, and you are a specialist, obviously. So I would like to ask about this cross-shaped formation, because you mentioned that, and I think also in your articles you have written about that you believe that this is a sort of a way to preserve the body or the remains as a saint. And you use this analogy to Saint Hedvika of Silesia. And my question is it possible in both cases that it is a sort of a way to collect the remains of the saint, waiting for the formal canonization, elevation? Do we know, for example, in the case of Trebnice and Saint Hedvika remains, in which moment her remains were there? If it was before, in this case, papal canonization, or after that? Because I know that there are some arguments that in the early Middle Ages, some burials in sarcophagus, how do you call it? Sarcophagus, yes. Yeah. The way that in fact sometimes this way of burial was chosen in the case of people who are expected to be elevated later. So maybe it might be an analogy, because obviously this is not a regular burial in the ground. Yes, this is something which already not in the ground in any sense.
More deeply explain the place. The basilica was rebuilt after the fire in 1141, and a new hall was built, elevated hall. We don't know where was situated the main altar in the origin basilica, in the old basilica. Probably around these places, because there was this burial ground of Premyslid. Probably it could be very near, maybe up to this cross-shaped altar. Anywhere here was Ludmila buried, and all the Premyslid. When the elevated hall after the reconstruction in 12th century was made, a main altar was transferred there. And in this place, probably in the same place, was renamed or newly created altar of St. Cross. And it means that from all the circumstances, Ludmila's remains were all the time in the same place. We don't know more about the first grave, but I think that it was very near to these places. And then all the remains stood all the time in this place. And why I think that Ludmila was placed in this cross-shaped grave, we don't know about more relics of saints in St. George Villa, except St. George arm, but it was placed on a main altar in reliquary. And the cross-shaped building was a little destroyed by the grave of Boleslav II, who died 999. When they dug the grave for Boleslavus, they a little destroyed this cross-shaped building. And it means then if Ludmila was placed there, they could elevate his remains because the shape was a little damaged. And also it was time when saints and relics of saints were lifted from the graves in the earth, and they were lifted to altars and so on. And so if we collect all this data with textile, this row is appearing.